In this demo, I want to get you familiar with some of the design time data capabilities in Visual Studio 2012 and 2013. We're going to go ahead and start with a fresh new project. We'll make it a WPF project called Design Time Data. I'm going to add into the solution my data layer that I've been using in other demos. So I'll add an existing project, and I'll go find my ZaData project. I need to update my NuGet packages to make sure both projects use Entity Framework. So now I've added Entity Framework to both projects. I need a connection string in my app config that's pointing to my ZaDatabase. The other thing I did here is add a reference from the Design Time Data project to the ZaData project so we can use it as our data layer. So the way you're going to get started with the Design Time features is to use the Data Sources window. You can get to it through View, Other Windows, Data Sources. You can see this is going to start up blank, and you can click on Add New Data Source. There's 4 choices here, but only one of them, Object, is the main one you're going to use. Database is going to put SQL statements and connections and things directly into your views, which is a bad idea from a separation of concerns perspective. Service is doing nothing more than shortcutting to the Add Service Reference dialog to hook up to a WCF service, generate a proxy and data contracts so that you can start calling that service. You can do that outside of this dialog. SharePoint, I'm not going to get into here, but Object is the one I want to focus on. So if I click Next, what I'm going to be presented are all the namespaces in my solution, and I can drill down and find the data objects that I want to work with. So I'm going to select Customer here as the object I want to work with. I click Finish, and Visual Studio is basically going to reflect on that assembly and that type and generate some information here in the Data Sources window that we can then use to start generating data-bound UI through drag and drop operations. You can see that it starts off with a customer and presents all the properties defined on that customer. By default, if I drag this out onto my UI here into the main window, it's going to generate a data grid with columns for each of the properties mapped to specific column types. Now, if we go look at the XAML that was generated, we can see it generated a data grid. It set up a binding that just says item source equals binding, so it's expecting a collection of customers to come down into this from somewhere. I'll show that in a moment. And then it defines explicit columns for each of the properties that it found on that data object, with each of those columns bound to the appropriate property on the customer object. It also generated up above, notice the window resources, created a collection view source, which we covered a little bit before and we'll cover more in a later module, but it's a iCollection view object that wraps some data collection. By default, it uses some design time data attributes that we'll be talking more about later in this module, but you can see basically it's specifying that the collection type is the customer type, and it indicates that it is a list of objects. And then it sets the data context on the root grid element to point to that collection view source. So it basically wires everything up so that the designer knows about the type of the object it's binding to. It can use the type information from that object to generate the bindings for the columns, and it sets up the bindings so that if you populate this collection view source at runtime with a collection of customers, the binding's going to kick in and you'll see that data. Now it also wired up the loaded event of the window, and if we go into the code behind, you can see that it's stubbed out some lines of code here where it gets a reference to the customer view source through a find resource call. And then it just has some commented out code here that says if you set the source property of that collection view source to a collection, then things are going to be ready to go. So I could drop in here and replace this commented out line of code with a call through our ZaDB context to go get the customers as a list and push those into the source property. And with just that much effort, I can go and start, and we can see our data being rendered out in a grid. Obviously, we have some layout to do here. The columns are probably not in the order that you want by default. You can go and start moving those around in the editor. And in the case of a data grid, moving those around is nothing more than grabbing a column and sliding it up and down within the environment. So those are the basics of generating a data grid through the Data Sources window based on some data-bound object type.